So I would just like to start with a small invocation to the Gurus. Guru Kripahi Kevalam. Guru Kripahi Kevalam. Guru Kripahi Kevalam. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat. Joy Guru, Joy Guru. We welcome each other by saying Joy Guru to all. That's how we greet. Guru is everything in this tradition. Uh, the inspiration, the leading light, the guiding force. So Guru Tattva is the most integral and essential part, uh, which we will discuss little more. We dwell and meditate on it little more. So I was thinking it's very difficult, to think about, conceptualize how to present the talk on bowels, because as Ram Sharma ji has said in his introduction, uh, it's very fairly limited understanding is there out there amongst the people, and ironically, even amongst the Bengalis and the urban Bengalis, more so specifically, there is absolutely limited understanding, and what usually limited understanding leads to is misperceptions and misrepresentations. And so that's, though it's not the best of the positive note to start, but this is an extremely essential aspect for me to start the talk with, by talking about what are the prevalent perceptions, misperceptions, representations, misrepresentations, and the notions, and probably wrong inferences, wrong impressions that people tend to have about the Baul tradition. Just trying to spread it out there, so that which will help us lead us into more deeper contemplation about the tradition, and think about and reflect about the essence beyond it, beyond all of this. So one of the perceptions usually that people pick up about bowls is, it is usually romanticized in a way that when people are traveling from Kolkata to northern Bengal, and they move to places like Kuch Bihar and all of that, and or even travel towards Assam, they cut across this belt of Birbhum, which is essentially where Shanti Niketan is also located, where Sri Rabindranath, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore had established this great eminent institution. And during that time, they travel. During this travel, one gets to see many bowls in the trains. They are singing the songs, they are singing some philosophical contemplations and words, and they see bowls in the train. That is one can say that is a sort of one first point of contact. And so what is it? You meet a stranger in a train, and once they get down, or you get down and you depart, and the story is over. One never gets to really immerse oneself into the universe, what they are bringing in their words and in their song and in their poetry. And even more over the years, it has been presented as the bardic traditions. The bardic traditions, especially, probably it emerged from the colonial studies. Bardic traditions, usually one tries to associate sort of a nomadic movement, from place to place. The traditional folk singers, they travel and they sing and they live, but that's not the case. Bowls do have their own stationary akras and ashrams, and it's a rooted tradition from that perspective. They do travel. They do travel for a purpose, which we will also dwell during the course of the talk. Um, then over the time, it has got a label of being a folk tradition. Uh, it's not that folk is any less, but again, even from the artist perspective, if one were to look at it, somewhere deep down, this folk and classical, these dichotomies become totally false or irrelevant. You know, in whatever means the inspiration that artist or that person or that creative vision a person is holding is just expressing it in a particular way. And to relegate it and compartmentalize it, it becomes all the more irrelevant. And just imagine Bowls are talking about a very high tattva, and then you just tell them your folk or something like that. And or just ask them, okay, you are singing a song, so what is the raga you are singing? And they will tell the raga. You tell them, you ask them what is the rhythm that you are singing, and there is a tal, there is a rhythm to it. So how is it different from any classical or anything else? So this can be contested very healthily, and there can be. I'm sure this is beyond the scope of such a conversation, but more so importantly, they are not folk from the perspective that they are here to sing some songs about rural life and pastoral lives and trying to talk about the seasons or anything like that. You know, that which is usually the impression we try to get from the folk songs, you know, where there is a generic observation about the life and its rhythms. Here there is a lot of tattva, there is a lot of deeper meanings and spiritual contemplation that is going on if one were to enter deeply into this uh, sadhana, especially, right? So it is definitely not folk, and it cannot be relegated or compartmentalized into the aspect of the folk tradition. But unfortunately, since it got anyways enforced as folk, it then became open for all. There are many people who just wear dress like the bowls. You know, bowls especially wear a specially stitched, multicolored thatched robe, and there is a philosophical purpose for it. But people can just wear it now, you see, and then they can also sing the bowl songs because they like the songs and they are talking about something, and then they have this feeling, "Ami you ball, tumi you ball, shabai ball." You know, everybody is ball, and so just because there is some sort of a good philosophical contemplation, you know, that cannot work that way. There has to be a sort of commitment, deep commitment, uh, and this has become very popular. And unfortunately, those who are not initiated into the tradition are the ones who are making it sound more like a popular folk tradition. Of course, it brings them livelihood. There is no problem in it. Everybody has to go through the livelihood process, but one cannot, in a way, co-opt a very established tradition. So that's one of the important things. And so you see a lot of them over the pandals and then pujas and all that. They just come and sing and dance and sing baul songs, and we think that is what bauls is. Some other interesting things that have happened, more historically put in a perspective, what happened especially in 50s, 60s, and 70s, you know, during that transition time, especially West started taking deep interest in the Indian spiritual thought and traditions, right? And so they came. There are many hippie movements and a lot of things that got associated over here. So it was sort of a confluence and collaboration between the two civilizations and cultures that have happened. Uh, if one were to deeply look into it, honestly speaking, it looks like a confluence and collaboration. But during this phase, definitely there was always one culture which had more voice and more power to express what they are doing, and obviously it was more of a Western thought. And so anything that from Indic traditions or our traditional knowledge touched, of course there have been very sincere seekers who have received it with the right spirit, but eventually this touch meeting points were always colored in the value systems that are more dominant in the Western societies. So one of the big things that was to happen was we had great, great poets and social leaders and movement leaders like Bob Dylan taking interest into Bowls, right? So, and they have collaborated songs with the Bowls. And so what then happens is then when Bowls and post-independent India is enamored by how West sees us, how the West validates us, and So if somebody is doing yogasana in front of us, we do not really validate that so much. But when that is being appreciated by the West and it has traveled to the West and it rebounds to us, and then we say, you know what, yogasana is so important, we have to do it. So a similar kind of echo from the Western bounds has happened even in the Baul tradition, and what it got interpreted or misinterpreted or superficially interpreted as some sort of a humanist movement. Oh, Bowls are talking something against the culture that is well established in the society, the societal norms. Their main obsession or their main preoccupation is about to make a criticism or a critiquing comment about the conventional value systems of the society and all that. At the immediate superficial look, it looks right. Oh, yes, that is what they are doing. But no, the space from where their narrative is arriving is a totally different spiritual place. And this can be equated with any other devotional movements, the bhakti movements that have happened across India. And this gets a false equivalence, in my view. And so then, lot of people who were very politically extremely or socially sensitive, and they had their genuine affiliations towards the ideological systems. They thought, oh, Baul is about certain freedom in the and they started using phrases like counterculture and all of that, right? So all these perceptions and misperceptions and misrepresentations or false representations or superficial representations, this kind of dominated the space, especially in the post-independent India. And when this hippie movement and when this sort of a little more interpretations about the social critiquing and all that got a more dominance rather than the spiritual dimension of the tradition, what it ended up doing is you see a huge influx of the urban populace that comes over here and spends time with the Bowls over the weekends and hangs out with them, so to say. And and Bowls have certain practices, and they are deeply interested in trying to enter into the Bowl realms of the practice and all of that. And there is a lot of mishmash, which has resulted in further deepening these misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and that keeps happening even now, unfortunately. So this is what I would say are the perceptions which are very dominant and right now about the Bowls. uh, but if one were to go a little more deeper, you have, beyond these misperceptions or half truths or uh, and the wrong inferences that we have drawn about the Bowls, you will see someone as great as Sri Rabindranath Tagore, who has established this great institution of Shantiniketan in the heart of the Bowls land. And the Bowls are predominantly from these districts of Birbhum and erstwhile undivided Bengal, and they cut across into the Bangladesh and Nadia and all of those places. And so when Sri Rabindranath Tagore Gurudev was there, it is a well established fact, even scholarship wise, that he was very deeply influenced by the some aspects of the devotional philosophy from the Vaishnava thought process. But if you were to look more keenly, it is not Vaishnava as in Vaishnava itself, but it was the Bowls who have influenced him. In fact, Nabani Kepa, who is a great Baul master, and uh, he was he was in fact made the first and the only and still only official professor or of sorts in Shantiniketan when Sri Rabindranath Tagore was there to teach Baul. So that was the vision Sri Rabindranath Tagore had, and one can always see in his own musings and in his own poetry, there is an element that he brings about which has a touch of mysticism, touch of uh, gazing at the unknown in the way that the Bowls do. And so that is the sort of an impact that the Bowls had. And even more importantly, another towering figure and the most important one, even from uh, modern Indian spiritual thought perspective, is Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And when Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa in Kathamrita, he actually is talking, having conversation with his disciples, and he tells, yeah, in the context of the devotion, and he is reflecting on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and all of that. And then he arrives at the conversation about the Bowls. And then he says, Bowls come out of the mist, they sing, they dance, they're joyous, and then they vanish back into the mist, and nobody understands what they said, and nobody understands them, who they are. And it's a very profound statement, and he really puts them at a pedestal for the sense of freedom that they embody. And this is what Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa has said. So you have, now we are entering into the real deeper realms of the devotional purpose and the substance of philosophy, what she, what Bowles as a tradition have brought to the fore. So if we were to reflect a little more deeply onto the aspect of what Baul, then what exactly is this devotional aspect, what Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa or Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore have seen in them? What is exactly this power of devotion that they are talking about? So then we have to understand the Baul philosophy from the spiritual perspective, which actually it is. And if you were to ask me what then Baul is, and even for the topic of this talk, I said it's a yoga bhakti tradition. And I could have said bhakti yoga tradition. But you will understand why I said yoga bhakti tradition is because they are first and foremost yogins. They are yogins, right? And they are they are masters of bliss. They know how to extract the nectar of life. That is their capacity of yoga. So now coming a little bit more about the diverse aspects of the bowls, you will, and bowl is not just one word. You actually have um, you have bowl, owl, bowl, shai, darvish. We have these four sub traditions, which are part of the bowls, which are part of one sect in a way, and there are minor variations amongst them, which we cannot probably get into it. It will be too much of an information at this point in time. And you will see that uh, the songs that the Bauls sing are called Mahajanirpad. They are not just songs. They are not just songs as in folk songs or anything else. They are called Mahajanirpad. They are the songs and the words of the great souls. And even in what they have done through their practice is they have established a complete spiritual culture which has a exhaustive, comprehensive rituals, the ritual system, their inner rituals and outer rituals. For instance, the way they transact or conduct with the world and the life is uh, by doing madhukari. Right, madhukari is honey gathering. They just and or it can be called as akashavritti, means whatever the sky gives they will take for the day. So they travel in the villages. So you can just imagine a household in the village, and the head of the household and the one who is leading the house or the one who is leading the kitchen, they are lighting up the chula, and they are about to cook, and they are totally engrossed in their life, and they are engrossed with their challenges, and their mind is soaked into the day-to-day conventional reality that they have to face on a sustaining and survival basis. And they hear the harinam at the door suddenly, right? And this is such a transformative experience at the household. And somebody is coming, a sadhak and a saint is coming and singing the harinama, and it touches them, and that's a very powerful interaction that has happened. And this is what bowls do. They come and purify the environment of the households. They give the harinam, they sing the harinam, they sing the praise of the Krishna, they sing the praise of the Guru. And this is a very powerful exchange, and this powerful exchange that the bowls have been doing for not decades but centuries. And this sort of holding up the culture and tradition bottom up, and holding it from the roots is, honestly speaking, it goes totally unnoticed. Not that these great traditions or the masters of these traditions have ever sought out for the credit, But in the overall scheme of things, uh, even from the Indic traditions perspective, while we really deeply appreciate, and rightly so, the great philosophical systems that have come forth, and be it the darshanas, be it many diverse spiritual traditions that have come forth, at the end of the day, at the roots, the people in the villages, people from the certain strata of the society, they are held and glued to the dharmic ways of living, is essentially because of traditions like this. And this never gets clearly acknowledged or appreciated or even reflected. And this happens across India. Its bowls are just a kind of a representation of what happens in the eastern part in a way. And I'm just putting it out as loud as my thought that this should be given a greater space. There has to be a greater acknowledgement. It is for our own benefit, our own survival. In fact, if I were to make that statement, and not doing so is at our own peril. And so this they have been doing it for centuries, going from house to house. And the villagers, they would have grown something out of their hands, with their hands they would have grown potato or rice or something. They will come and give it to the bowls, and bowls get that. And bowls are living either in some part of the village or in the corner and the edges of the village. And usually, sometimes I have seen most often that that particular space has been given by the villagers. They really like to have a sadhu, around, so that not all the time they're immersed in the worldly challenges, but they are touched by the wisdom of the masters whenever that is needed. So this is where I wanted to play a small video. This is of our Param Guru, Shri Sanatan Das Baul, and this is, since it is buffered on YouTube, you might have, kind of raise up your volume. Uh, but I'll just play it for 2 minutes. Here, Shri Sanatan Das Baul is singing in his akhada in Sonamukhi village in Bankura district in Bengal. And this was shot, it's a very rare footage and lucky to have that it was shot in mid 1980s. Um, just one second. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I hope you could hear the video a little bit. So that was
No, I think the voice was
It was
very
very
low.
low actually. The volume was very low, I think.
okay.
But it's fine. That's
But
okay.
Okay.
what we will do is during final editing we will incorporate it. You
Okay.
know,
Fine. Thank you. Thank
no
you for that.
problem. The final
So
final output will be okay.
okay. So basically, the purpose of showing that video was to at one glimpse and at one glance to give you a perspective of what does the Baul world look like. That is the small akda. That was his house, and where the villagers have gathered for the evening to listen to the philosophy. After the day long of the work, and through the day they have worked, they have toiled, and they want to come and spend some time. And the guru is very kind enough to give his wisdom at that point in time. And there are way too many things out there, and if one were to pay attention, Baba is playing his dugi, he is playing his ek tara, and you can also listen in the video to the nupur that he's playing, and the rhythm is just perfect and sync. He's all, if one can say, the one man band, one man orchestra altogether. And he's also singing at the same time, and he's spinning, and he's moving almost so light, like a just like a feather. Everything has a very very strong yogic implication in that, in what he has done at that moment. And apart from doing that exchange with the villagers and transmitting his knowledge and wisdom to the villagers, what he has done is also, uh, it's years and years of sadhana. He was probably into his mid 60s by then, right? And he's moving, and while he's sharing that song. uh, so this is sort of the Baul word. This is actually the truly the Baul word. This is the Akhada. It is just as much lit. In fact, I had an opportunity to visit him way back in 2014. I was entering the village and I was thinking maybe, oh, ashram guru means something big will be there. I will be entering into a gate. Then suddenly, on the mud road, I was shown. Now we have to enter inside. There was not even a boundary to the house. And when I entered and when I met Baba over there that afternoon, and he was totally, he was in his he was 95 already, and he was in on the bed in the mosquito net, and it was his tea time, and he just, I just waited outside the room, and he was about to get up from his bed and take his Padmasan posture, and so that he is about to have his tea. And every single gesture is like a ritual. Not an ounce of energy is wasted. This is at least the sense that I have received, that, oh, there is so much that is absolutely sahaj. There is something absolutely spontaneous in his movements. And and I went and I saw him. He looked into my eyes, and something really important transpired. And he looked into my eyes through the mosquito net, and then he asked me something. And then I observed him closely, how he took the tea, how he dipped the small biscuit in the tea, and how he scratched, his head on the skull cap. He was just wearing a, not a skull cap, what that monkey cap during the winters. He was wearing that, and he was scratching his head over that. Everything was so vivid. And then gradually I could synchronize myself and get integrated with his environment. Then I understood I'm in the presence of the master. It is his domain that I have entered. He has allowed me to enter his domain. And then I started seeing outside from his room, you would just see one coconut tree right in front of it standing, and there is a tulsi plant, and then there are birds going and coming. Everything was synchronized with his presence. So it was not for me, at least personally, some sort of serendipity and personal romanticism that I was building into the presence over there, but it was for me a tangible vibration of a yogi who has worked years together on his in culturing his inner self and making that presence come out and make that impact. So that so this culture is an offering of Bowls to this universe and this world. And Bowls love to spend time in the satsangs. They conduct mahotsav, and they call mochav here, mahotsavs, and their gatherings and the sadhu gatherings. And why they do it is it's an integral part of their practice. they are not interested in just sitting in the chopal and discussing the political matters of the day. They are here to share the insights with the sadhaks who are growing up, the people the practitioners who are coming up. And so they meet up, they spend time together, they exchange, they debate, they have conversations of the spiritual thoughts. And this happens a lot in Bengal, right? So like the melas, the Kumbh Mela, but there are many, many, many micro melas, that happen. And that's truly is what has held our culture and tradition in many ways at the spiritual front. And even when you enter a sadhu gathering, you would immediately see that not all are of the same order and level. Then you will suddenly see, oh, okay, uh, there are goshais who are scholar practitioners, not necessarily singing, by the way. They need not, they are not so much into singing and expressing their inner practices through the songs, but they are the ones who have understood the philosophy very well. They are the ones who are guiding all the time. So you can imagine a mahotsav or a sadhu gathering where a new practitioner of the Baul is entering and standing in the middle of the Goshais, and they are presenting their inner experiences through the songs. And the Goshais can sometimes tell, theek gaya hai, you have sung well, but that expression is not really top notch. It did not really touch the bhava. That means you are only singing, you have not felt it, you have not experienced it. So obviously you are not given your certification to move on further. Your dissertation has been rejected for the day. So this is how our culture, of mutual assessment, it is a methodical approach. So Bowles, when that's the reason when anybody says being really impacted by the philosophy of the Bowles is one part to it, but there are one has to get initiated. It's a path totally that is of an initiation. A guru has to initiate somebody, who is aspirant, and this initiation is clearly the path that is a path of commitment. That means you are being initiated, and at that point of initiation you are also getting your responsibility to uphold the practice and uphold the tradition. That is the commitment that you are taking up. And even in the process of the journey, there is the sthula level of the sthula, that is a very beginner level. And then there is a pravartaka, where there is a little more advancement, where the person is able to get, the aspirant or the practitioner is able to get the grasp of his inner journey better. And then there is a sadhaka, where there is a more internalization of the sadhana throughout. And then there is a siddha, who has attained certain mastery in certain aspect of the tradition and the wisdom. So such clear gradations are there. So when somebody says that I just like this philosophy and poetry and I can wear something like this and say, Ami you ball, to me you ball, Shabai ball, I am ball, you are ball, and everybody's ball, it's not going to work that way. So this particular commitment has to be taken, this initiation has to be taken, and it's a very solid Guru Shishya Parampara. Like as I have said, not only Bauls, even from the Nath Parampara, even from the Kapaliks, even from the Aghoris, and when you see that, Avadhuta Marga, where the Guru is made the ultimate. These are all Guru Yoga, paths of Guru Yoga, where the Guru is the ultimate and Guru is the ultimate guide. It's not that they do not have the deities in the process or devatas or the Ishta devatas in the process. They do have, but Guru is the ultimate power who presides over even your understanding and grasp of your Ishta devata, and they can enhance that. Right? So even that can happen. In some cases, probably the devata is not there at all, but it is more about reflecting on the inner aspects and the philosophy. Right. So if you were to ask who are the Bauls, then the Bauls are the yogis of the Nada. They are the ones who are working with the sound. They are working with the mantra. They are also working with the Mahajanirpad, the songs of the great souls. That these songs have come as an expression from their deep inner practice. And who are the Bauls? They are the yogis of the prana. That is, they are really top notch, and they have to be top notch in terms of managing their control on prana. And their prana is not only in terms of the breath, even in terms of their emotions, even in terms of their thoughts, and every level. That is a complete yogic sadhana that they have to do. And it is then integrate that prana, the breath. They call it Damer Kaj in the Baul community. Damer Kaj means Dam means the breath, and it's working with the breath. They work in a particular way, and they have to integrate the sound with the breath. They have to integrate everything with the breath, so that the breath propels them. The yogic breath that they have developed, that's what propels them in their sadhana. They are the yogis of devotion, and this is the most important aspect. At the end, they work with developing power of emotion, power of devotion in their hearts. The main premise that they take is that if the yogic body is not there in place, then even the success in the aspect of devotion will not be achieved. You see, and so in order to really hold the power of the devotion in their bodies, that they conduct, they do these yogic practices and prepare their body in those ways. So that is a very, very important aspect. And they have this inner connection with something called as Moner Manush, what they refer to as. This is man of the heart. This was translated by Sri Rabindranath Tagore. Moner Manush, Mon in this case is referred to as the heart, and the presence in the heart of a powerful force that is an inner guide and inner light which is flashing its guidance for the sadhaka in the yogic process. That is what Moner Manush is. So this is what bowls are. So if you were to reflect in comparison with what we have discussed, initially about the misperceptions and the misinterpretations, you already see that there is a lot more. There is a huge depth to the tradition. It's a yogic tradition, right? And it is not just about the songs. It is not just about singing something mystical in that way. And now coming, uh, I don't know how much time we have. So I will be taking now a phase of trying to discuss about where did this all come from, trying to put it in a little bit of historical context and historical perspective. And that is Bowls and Owl, Baul, Darvesh, Shai, all of them are connected to Vaishnava Sahajiyas. This is the main parampara in a way. In fact, not even Vaishnava prefix or a tag came in a little later sense, but they are the path from the Sahajiya path, essentially. And what is this Sahajiya path is we have to look a little bit into the uh, historical aspect of the traditions. And the Sahajiya path is more connected with that of the Bauddha traditions, right? And you have the if you were to I would dive a little into the Bauddha traditions, but what I would want to keep all the people in mind is that while I am telling this timeline about the Bauddha traditions and how it evolved into the Sahajiya, and how it came into the Bauds, please always keep in mind parallelly there are the other dharmic traditions of the Tantra, Kashmir Shaivism. All of this is parallelly developing at the same time, and there is a huge interrelation in terms of the yogic, hatha yogic, tantric practices, and always an exchange and dialogue that is happening, sometimes competitively as well, between both the traditions as well as the other tantra traditions. And in fact, we had recently one of the talks here on the same forum which gave a very good elaborate introduction about the development of the Shakta Tantra and the Kaula Paramparas. So that is happening parallelly while I am discussing all of this. So primarily, to put it in the Bauddha traditions, you would have um, the Hinayana traditions, or the first and foremost, the traditions of the Bauddha were called as the Hinayana, and this particular phase was occupied a lot with the ethical dimensions and the moral dimensions of the religion, and it was definitively a sort of a monk order. It is for the people to move away from the society and relinquish the society and pursue the path of the nirvana in their own capacity and become the arhat. And this was the Buddha's teachings. This was basically what is this suffering? Explore, investigate the suffering, end the suffering by your investigation, and attain nirvana. And this, to put it in simple terms. And the next chakra that has happened, and then that resulted in a more philosophical development, and it could be roughly placed around third third century AD, third to fifth century AD, or even little earlier than that, is the Mahayana traditions. And especially in this, some of the notable figures are Nagarjuna, Asanga, Vasubandha, all of them especially connected with the Nalanda university aspect. And they were developing the Madhyamika path, wherein its main approach was simply this: you present anything, they just have to logically refute it, in the sense that there is no entitiveness to it. There is no fireness to the fire, no treeness to the tree, no waterness to the water, no thingness to the thing. You present anything out there, they have a very systematic, argumentative, or a debating way, drawing the logical inferences to refute the entitiveness or the thing. Thus, in fact, this is in consistency with the very much Buddha's early propositions that is there a self? Perhaps the pursuit of the self itself leads to the desire, and the desire itself leads to the suffering, and therefore relinquishing the notion of the self is all the more better, unless and otherwise it has been confronted and realized. So there is no point in inferential realization of the self. You see, so this aspect continues even in the Mahayana, and all that they have to do is you present your case, they have to logically refute it, make inferences, and say it doesn't work. Peel the skins of the onion and just show that there is no onion in there eventually. So that is what has to be done. So, but under the Mahayana, even it is said, even great Nagarjuna is said to have had an exposure to a development which seemed more a competitive one in a way with the Mantrayana. So the Mahayana had one Madhyamika path, which was very philosophical in nature, and then the Mantrayana, which was developing and which had started dealing with the ritual systems, the mudras, the mandalas, right? And this development was happening in Mantrayana. Now it's a very interesting thing that Buddha has asked or exhorted everybody to move away from these rituals and give up, these rituals. But eventually here come and they land up here in the rituals once again. So you can just understand how competitive was the spirit, because it was rituals, and even from an Indian perspectives, they are something, they are definitive. They give results then and there. Whatever could be the conceptualization of the results, be it the Kaulachara, be it the Shakta Tantras, be it any of that, they are very, very deeply ritualistic in the way that you do this, you will get these results. It's very clearly given. So it obviously becomes very competitive when your methods are very contemplative in nature, as opposed to this. So they started developing rituals, they started developing mandalas and various methods. And in fact, the three other vehicles that get categorized as part of this Mahayana when Vajrayana, the next cycle that emerged, was which is Mantrayana, which is continuing the mantras and the mudra, and the Kalachakrayana, which is the very exclusive focus on the mandalas and doing the rituals around the mandalas. And then there is something called as Sahajayana, which is the path of the Sahajiyas, where the emphasis is given on for the yoga. Here the Sahajiyas said, you know what, let's not take rituals and mandalas and all of this too seriously. So when they composed their poetry, and their songs are called the Charya Giti or Doha Kosha, Pandit Hariprasad Shastriji, a great exponent at the turn of the century, the last century, the turn of the 20th century rather, and he was the one who got this from the Nepal royal family, and he discovered these Doha Koshas, wherein these were the poetical compositions of the practitioners of the Sahajiyana path, where you will come across, they say, na Ravi, na Shashi, na Mandala, na Bindu, na Nada. All these are aspects which are very much related with certain ritualistic or a tantric way of looking at things. And they said, no, we have to go beyond all of this. We have to go into something which is more spontaneous. We have to enter into the truth directly. Even one of the songs says, that if you have to look at the bangle on your hand, what is the point of getting a mirror and looking at the bangle in the mirror? Why don't you look at the bangle directly? And they also brought in the philosophical differences in giving a great deal of affirmation in a way to the world. Bhava Nirvana. This is one of the songs by Sarahapada and Kanopada, one of the songs by the Kanopada, one of the Siddha Acharyas of the Sahaja Marga and Sahajiya Marga. He says, Bhava and Nirvana, the existence and the Nirvana are the same. There is no difference between both. And you will also come across very important aspects such as the yogas that they followed under the Sahajiyana. They are broadly classified as the Charya, the tantras that were classified as the Charya Tantra, and you had the Kriya Tantra and the Yoga Tantra, and then you had Anuttara Yoga Tantra. Anuttara means in the alphabets the alphabets, the first alphabet is A, and there is nothing beyond A. Anuttara. A is the northmost, so there is nothing beyond A. So these were the very advanced tantras. They were given as a practices step after the step, and here it was during this juncture, in the Vajrayana, the Shaktis as the consort of Buddha started appearing. Because the Tantra means essentially you have the presence of the Shakti, and you are looking at yourself even from the Shiva Shakti Parampara, or the Shakta Parampara. You will see yourself as both Shakti and Shiva, the aspects, and then the union of them and the interplay between them, and how they can grant you the Nibbana or the Moksha or whatever is the ultimate state. And a similar template was emerging even in the Bauddha paths. And these were the Dhyani Buddhas. There are these 5 Buddhas who had, each one of them had as a consort. I think these were the Taras. I'm not very sure the Tara deities, but they were the consorts of this Dhyani Buddha. So this is how the Shakti started emerging as a consorts in the tantric aspect of the Buddhas. So these tantras and there was another eminent name called Indrabhuti, who was the daughter of one of the kings of the Orissa. By then, this Sahajiyana and the Vajrayana was widely prevalent in Bengal. So, both we had Nalanda and we had Vikramashila here in more eastern parts. And so they were widely spread. How this was widely spread, I had an opportunity to meet Professor Suniti Kumar Patak, who is 95-year-old scholar who lives in Shantiniketan, and he played an important role in translating a lot of Tibetan works back and interpreting, how the works went from India to Tibet, and then he reinterpreted them back. And his contributions are to Asiatic Society, and they are there even in the Shantiniketan library. And he's very eminent scholar. He said, just imagine in Nalanda, the aspirants used to enter the gates of the Nalanda, and the scholars used to guard the gates of the Nalanda. They used to conduct interviews there, and 8 out of 10 people were sent back. Those were the standards of Nalanda. So in such times, even those masters in Nalanda realized during the changing times that it is because the institution is sustaining because of the contribution of the society, and there was a possibility that the great masters stepped out of Nalanda and interacted with the village folks and the rural folks, and then interacted and gave them a lot of wisdom, and that transmitted into the sects which are like the Sahajiyana paths, and where eventually the Bauls, all of them emerged. The wandering, singing practitioners of the Sahaja path also emerged out from there. So this was sort of precursors and the primers for what would be coming across as the Vaishnava Sahajiya tradition later. And all of this was intensely happening in the eastern part of the country. So that's kind of a good stretch of timelines, and we all know what happened in 12th, 13th century onwards, the Islamic invasions, and we have Nalanda vanishing, and we have Vikramashila and thousands of books burnt and all of that, and it obviously created a huge unfavorable circumstances for all sorts of spiritual practitioners, and thousands of monks, and all of them had to face these challenges. And it was during this time, parallelly, if you would see the Gita Govinda and the Bhakti Parampara of the Jayadeva, and all of this is developing gradually in the eastern parts. The Vaishnava Parampara is taking more and more stronger hold. And at this point in time, the Vaishnava Parampara is also talking about something like the union of Radha and Krishna, and the Vrindavan, and the joy and the blissful experiences of the Vrindavan, which sounded absolutely in conjunction with the Mahasukha that the Sahajiyas were discovering and they were seeking out for. So, cutting long story short, here when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared on the screen and the great Gaudiya Vaishnava movement, finally emerged, and a very significant difference from the Gaudiya Vaishnava movement with other Vaishnava movements is the other Vaishnava movements still consider the Upanishadic Samhitas and the Bhashyas, all of them are still very, very important, the most fundamental texts. But the Gaudiya Vaishnava path, while respecting them, gave an emphasis, out and out emphasis to Bhagavata Purana. So, where Krishna became the most central figure. So, here you have what we have is Krishna in his Vrindavana has created Vrindavana, and this Krishna in Vrindavana is the ultimate form to whom our devotion and the waves of devotion move towards. And this Krishna and this Lord is the ultimate Lord, is beyond everybody, and this is the ultimate truth. And he is the one who has put gopis, gopikas, and Radha, and everyone has given them place in the Vrindavana to rejoice these leelas. And the devotional path of the Gaudiyas is essentially to encourage us to take the bhava of these gopis and emulate and reflect and meditate that bhakti bhava and reach Krishna. So this is predominantly the philosophical aspect of the Krishna Prema. And even in this devotion, it's not just a feel-good feeling in the heart. This is a progressive devotion. There is the Vaidhi Bhakti, the Sadhana Bhakti, where there are certain rituals that are done even within the Gaudiya Parampara. Then you have the Raganuga Bhakti, Ragatmika Bhakti. It gets more and more finer way of cultivating the devotion. But the emphasis is never so much on the yoga. There is no yoga aspect so strongly that is emphasized in these Bhakti traditions. But the Sahajiyas already are established in the yoga. So these Sahajiyas, for instance, when Nitai or Nityananda Mahaprabhu, who was the associate of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he played an extremely crucial role in taking the Sahajiyas into the fold of the Vaishnava path. Already there are the Sahajiyas, they are doing their practices, but the hostile environment. So it was he has given them a sort of a shelter by giving the Harinama, and his son Veerabhadra was given especially an important task of getting them under the fold of the Vaishnava path. And then came the Vaishnava Sahajiyas, from where you see the Aul, Baul, Shai, Darvesh, moving out. And there might be their versions of the stories. Each of these subsects, there might be their versions of the stories of their own historicity, how they have come about and all of that. But what I'm broadly giving you is a broader picture, how these traditions have emerged eventually. For instance, there is this great story, the legend that goes not very far from where we stay, over 30-40 kilometers. There is an ashram of Khepima, which is easily a 400-year-old ashram. Khepima, Veerabhadra Goshai, he actually chose about 1,000 practitioners and gave them all of them the sadhana paddhati, that you practice this and you develop your sadhana. That's how for many years he has given them sadhana. After that, he conducted a test, apparently, out of which he chose 22 men and one woman practitioner who is Khepima. And they were like the guiding lights for all these subsects, which were there. And they were the go-to people, and especially Khepima was the towering figure, and she was taking care of the samadhis where there is the Jiva Samadhis, where the gurus have literally taken the Samadhi while they were alive. And Kepima was like the leading light for all the sects. Everybody used to come to her to take her guidance. So she would be probably one of the most earliest, Vaishnava Sahajiya practitioners who has guided in this way thousands of people. So that's broadly, how the Vaishnava Sahajiya and the Bauls and the rest of the sub traditions that have emerged from the Sahajiya path, from the Bauddha traditions, in a way. I think we are more or less at the edge of the time. So I would probably just conclude by saying a few words about us specifically in the Sanatan Siddhashram, from where we are, from where I'm talking, is the vision that was given to us by Sanatan Baba was, the Bauls actually have interacted with the villagers, with the communities, with the societies by doing the Madhukari, by interchanging the spiritual power to the material sustenance that was given. But all that is going right now. There is a deep cultural attrition. There is nothing anymore to hold the roots of the masters and the traditions, and there is hardly any assurance. So in this time, there is a need for us to take a more contemporary and modern approach. So he encouraged us and he gave guidance to Srimati Parvati Baul, and who is the lineage holder for Baba's tradition as well. And he guided her to establish Sanatan Siddhashram and make it more like a little more, if we cannot call it a formal Gurukula, but bring in that more structured approach. It is needed in the modern times. Otherwise, there is no Shakti in the culture, in the society anymore to hold this tradition. So that is what essentially we do here. And we serve the other Baul families. We conduct Ayurvedic medical camps for them. And we are trying to encourage their children who have that innate ability to be connected with the roots, but they find sustenance and survival challenges. We encourage them to take up this path. And by the help of many practitioners and the sadhaks, across the globe, in fact, who come and help us and do the seva here. So that's pretty much today's talk.
I just wanted to, one thing I was wondering, I had read there somewhere that, the mention of, similar people like Bauls is there in the Mahabharata. So I'll just read it out and then I'll ask you. They are mentioned as Kathakas. They are mentioned that तम प्रयांतम महाबाहुम कौरवाणाम यशस्करम अनुजग्मुर महात्मानो ब्राह्मणा वेद पारगाः वेद वेदांग विद्वांसः तथैव चाध्यात्मिक चिन्तकाः चौक्षाश्च भगवत भक्ताः सूताः पौराणिकाश्च ये कथकाश्च परे राजन श्रवणाश्च वनौकसः and divyakhyanani ye chapi pathanti madhuram dvija. So here a host of people have been mentioned who are accompanying Arjun in his in the it is mentioned in the Arjun Vanvas Parva, and there are people mentioned who are very adept at reciting the tattva of the Puranic kathas and the Vedic akhyans, and they are mentioned in the same league along with the Shramanas and Vanaukashas, that is the forest dwellers, and Vedanga Panditas. So can we compare or connect the Baul tradition with this mention of these Kathakas and other people mentioned in here in the Mahabharata?
Well, I think taking it all the way back to Mahabharata would be a fast stretch, honestly. But what I have to see it is that we have to just look, if we look at Bauls and the Vaishnava Sahajiyas, essentially see, when there is this big shift that has happened from the Sahajiya path to the Vaishnava fold, obviously one of the important things is that we have to introduce something as Moner Manush, Sahaj Manush, as a entitative aspect that has come into the picture, which would not have been possible within the Bauddha thought. You see, so there, which is equal to Brahman, which is equal to Antaratman, which is equal to Paramatman in many ways. So this is subscribing to the traditional dharmic view. Now, even before Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, even before the Jayadeva, you have so much of poetry which is filled with devotional, aspects, right? That goes across the country, even especially in the southern part of India. The Bhakti traditions are very, very, very ancient. In fact, the Bhagavatars, as such, they are called Bhagavatars. Be it the Shaiva Bhagavata or the Vaishnava Bhagavata or Krishna Bhagavatars, they were very much present. Even as you have mentioned or read out, even in the Mahabharata aspect. So these Bhagavatars are. These are the ones who have upheld the devotional aspect, who were like the primary seed sowers in a way. So that sort of, we can definitely look at it as the same dhara of the devotion, which is reflecting even in the bouts. But to beyond that, the storytelling aspect is also a little bit there in bouts, which is taken from again from the Vaishnava paramparas, where there is especially a lot of meditation about Krishna and his play in the Brindavana, and there is a Gopi Bhava. All these aspects are there very, very strongly. And yeah, so these could be the thing. And in one of the usual conversations, Sanatan Baba or Param Guru used to say, Baba, where did the bowl originate from? He would just simply say, from Shiva. He is the Adi bowl. See, for us, it's the simplest thing is to put everything on Shiva, because he is eternal, and because he is the Adi Yogi, he is the Adi Baul, he is Adi everything. He's uh, so Adinatha. Shiva is even Adinatha. Yeah, so the Natha Parampara, I have to say that this whole Sahajiya path is exactly a conjunction and a parallel with the Nath Parampara, by the way. There is literally an overlap of Matsyendranath, Gauraknath from the Nath Paramparas, who are even counted as the Siddhacharyas or the Sahaji Siddhas in the Sahajiyana path. Those parts. So yeah, this is what I can connect. That apart from that, one cannot probably take the whole aspect back to Mahabharata.
So I guess this Sahaj Nath, they also have a list of 84
Yes,
parallel
yes.
to the 84 Nath yogis. They have also
Yes,
a list of
they have this 84 Nath Siddha. They have 84 Siddhas. Even the Nath yogis are also sometimes overlapped and taken there. Luipa, Naropa, all of them are part of this. Kanopa, and all of them. The interesting part is that they were all also most of them were also householders, and they were like, somebody was a carpenter or somebody was like that. So it was kind of breaking away from what was going on, so to say, probably in the high seats of knowledge, say in Nalanda or somewhere else. And it used to say that the knowledge and wisdom passed and entered into the every strata of the society. And coming back to this aspect, there is no doubt that when bowls are doing their sadhana and when they connect with their inner truth and inner essence, there is a certain sense of freedom that emanates from there, which becomes absolutely unpredictable in terms of the nature that it manifests. From that sense of freedom, they do assert very clearly of their non-conformation to the norms of the norms and structures of the society. It is from that part that they do not subscribe to the conventions of the society. It is so, even be it the caste system, even be it the religious way of looking at the differentiation or subgrouping, they very clearly do not subscribe to that aspect. That comes from a sense of freedom. It doesn't come from their obsession to do some social political critiquing and make a statement about it. Because making a social political critiquing will bracket them into something else which they don't want to get trapped into anyhow.
So they are more like the Nath yogis in this aspect, right?
Yeah, yes, they are. They are like the Nath yogis. There are a lot of elements, and see, Natha yogis are the champions of the Hatha yoga, and the bowl has a very strong element and integral aspect of the Hatha yoga in there.
What is the population that practices this tradition today? They say demography is destiny, with modernity invading even the most ancient and deep traditions. I am keen to know if this unique tradition can be preserved for posterity.
Yeah, so there is an estimate. I cannot really tell with great deal of credibility what is the exact number, but there is an easy estimate of over 20,000 families of the bowl tradition, and that is there in and around, at least within the West Bengal part, the Birbhum and the traditional areas of the bowls. So yeah, but I think the larger part of the question was about the posterity and the holding the tradition and furthering it. This is a challenge that every tradition faces, bowls also face, and as I have said, at least the little uh, nominal step that we have taken in this direction with some commitment is to contextualize the transmission of this tradition and practice in the modern times. But definitely, what I can only speak from the space of the faith. See, at the end of it, each of these traditions have navigated extremely complex and challenging times in the past as well. So modernity is just one more, and I am sure they will have their own way of holding back the essence and still reformulating and remodeling themselves, which is more fit for the times that they are in. At the same time, not compromising on its fundamental principles. I think that is verily possible, and we see some examples. We very much see some examples.
Good evening, everybody. Actually, I had this uh, good opportunity to visit mm, Arvati Baul's house in Kerala, and where I was like gifted with a book. So I was going through that book, and also I've heard few songs by Lalon Shine. So I had this question regarding, like, I have two questions actually. So the first, which are based on the songs written by Lalon Shine. The first one that goes is, they talk about in that song. There's a specific line which says that, I'll say it in Bangla, then I'll translate that. Ke kotha koy re dekha deয় na, which means somebody speaks but we don't know who is it, and he is there right in front of me but I cannot find him even in 1,000 lives. Now this somewhat kind of resonates with what they say in Advaita Vedanta Darshana, that the Atman, which is exactly me but I cannot directly see it, and I have to do other Shravan Manan Nidhyasan to get into that. So my question is, are they somewhat in similar world? Do they hold similar worldview to Advaita, where they think that Brahman and Atman are one and the same? Or is there something more towards like a Vaishnava worldview where I am the part and he's the whole, and something like that? That is my first question. And the second question is, the Bauls talk about worshipping the man, which that this one song, Lalan Shai says that সহজ মানুষ ভোজে দেখ না রে মন দিব্য জ্ঞানে, which means that worship the man, knowing him as divine. So what do they actually mean? I mean, in worshipping the man, is it something from a very humanist perspective, or like something, it has something else, what they're saying? Yeah.
So your both questions are actually connected, and they are one question in a way. And what you have said, that does this seem like what is being said not only in Advaita Vedanta, that is our Vedantic treatise of even Upanishads. That's exactly what Bauls are also saying. And that's exactly what is being said, but not necessarily taking the same approach of the Advaita Vedantins, where there is a lot of debate and conversation about reflection and meditation about the unreality of the world. You see, that notion is not present in the Bauls. In fact, one of the important aspects which I have not said is that they are the yogis of the body and the prana. When I said yogis of the prana, they affirm fully the body. This can be again connected with the Annamaya Kosha, for instance, of the Vedanta, that they really recognize what philosophy are you talking about, what meditation are we talking about, what realization are we talking about. You take the body of the equation, everything falls away with the body. If the body is not there, there is no pursuit, there is no aspiration, there is no longing. Body becomes then not just the flesh and blood, but it becomes the Panchamahabhutas housing the spirit, housing the Atman. Right? That is what is being said in this case, is that this is a very important reflection, especially Lalon Shai telling that this Atman is there. It is the one which has Chaitanya, which has given Chaitanya to the body. It is the one which has energized it, it is the one which has created the reality around. If it is not there, then there is no Chaitanya. But still, I cannot see it. So I just have to find this Atman inside me, in a way. They don't obviously use the word Atman. They just use the words that what you have used, and that is pretty much the word that is of the Sahaj Manush. Sahaj Manush is something that is also defined in a way that that which has that which does not have hands but still can hold, that does not, that there is a Baul song, that which does not have the legs but still can walk, that which does not have the eyes but still can see. And what isn't it just like the Upanishadic ultimate Vedantic view, right? So and where is this Sahaj Manush beyond Saptatala? Where is the Saptatala, the seven chakras, and the here the Sahaj Manush? And you just go and figure out in our Vedantic aspects, and where is the notion of even when we do the Tantra Sadhana or when we invoke the Paramatma, we invoke the Atman, we invoke the Atman here, we invoke the Paramatma here, we invoke the Paramashiva here. So this is where the position is, that is where the Sahaj Manush. Sahaj Manush is also that act of spontaneity, that is complete. This is something very unique to the Sahaji aspect, that which is not conditioned, it essentially that is beyond all conditioning, beyond all gunas, beyond all tattvas, beyond all attributes, niranjana, in a way. So all of that. So both questions are pretty much the same. It's just that when it comes to the praxis, there is a very different orientation, the very different premises. Bowls work with the body. A lot of alchemical sadhana is there. This is what actually creates difficulty for some of the traditional schools, and usually they call them apasampradayas, and deviant spiritual practitioners. But that is not the case. No other tradition cannot set up the standard deviation for the other traditions. This is very much an integral aspect of this tradition, to accept certain practices with the body and work through the body and move from the gross to the subtle, and the subtle and subtler, and the most subtlest of the causal planes, and realize that.
The next question is from Ritika Vyas. She's asking, sir, like you said, Shiva was the first Baul. Sanatan Das Baul himself said this too. Then why do Baul music and philosophy do not sing any praises of Shiva and only Radha and Krishna?
So it is more when we say Shiva is the if you go Radha and Krishna and the Vaishnava Parampara, especially in the context of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, and you will go to the Bhagavata Purana. In fact, more than anywhere else, it is in the Bhagavad Purana you will find fantastic description of the Kailasha. See, so there is at some point or the other these differences totally blur into insignificance. Why not Shiva is there? Are, by the way, even sometimes Shiva is also contemplated. There are Shakta bowls also, and Bakreshwar is not very far from where we say Bakreshwar is a very important Shaiva center. But this part of Bengal, and the Bengal in general have two dominant forces, that is of the Shakta, from the Hindu dharmic perspectives, if we have to use, and Shakta, and that is Shakta is Devi, and the Krishna and the Bhakti movement. There was a very strong phase, in fact, of the Shaiva paramparas also in Bengal. Literally, it is said that some of the great Rajapurohits went from Bengal to the southern parts and to do even the agamic practices and rituals. But that did not sustain. Here, what sustained and what really became is like the place of the Krishna and Kali. So it just took that bhava. And when gurus are telling, Shiva is the Adi Baul, all that they mean to say is that we draw our origins. Even the Adi Natha is Shiva, Adi Yogi is Shiva. So Adi Baul is also Shiva, because there is a strong yogic element. And we should not thrust this particular view into a traditional Gaudiya Vaishnava worldview. That there Krishna is everything. So we have to respect that, and we move and we adapt to that. And when we have signed up and subscribed for it, and we follow those rules, as simple as that.
I would like to ask you about one misinterpretation that comes in such tradition, and that has been utilized by secularists also. Okay, that often happens with Kabir Panth, and that might happen with this mystical bards or sadhus or fakirs. So here is this one doha, I could say, is from Lalan Shahi, where he's saying that everyone asks, what religion does Lallan belong to this world? And then Lallan answers that, what does religion look like? I have never laid eyes upon it. Some use malas just to, for Hindu rosaries, other tasbis, Muslim rosaries. And so people say they belong to a different religion. So, but do you bear the sign of your religion when you come to, when you come to this world, or when you leave this world? Can you put this in context? Because we know now there is a fashion of Sarv Dharm Sambhav and secularist interpretation of rejecting all dharmic tradition or cultural aspect or ritualistic aspects of dharma, and then bring it into a fold of where, as you also mentioned in the beginning, that it seems that they are rejecting every cultural aspect and does not associate themselves with anything to do with dharmic traditions or ritualistic or culturalistic aspects of that. It has a way of getting misinterpreted and propagated as something, as sort of, going beyond all marks, religions, and all that when we talk about, mystical tradition.
No. There are two, three things to this, Ram Sharmaji. One is, in fact, I don't know if it is the same song or there are many such songs of the Lalan Shahi where he says, if you show me where the religion is, if I find that religion, I will hold it by its neck. So it comes from a certain stance, which I have already said. It is more to do with the spirit and the sense of freedom that one embodies in this yogic sadhana when one arrives at a certain freedom in their heart, and it gives them a stance. This has happened not only with Lalan Shahi, it has happened with great many spiritual leaders across the traditions. This is a very, what looks like a very universalistic appeal, which is more universal. I would not use the word secular, because I don't know if the word universal also probably has to go through a rigorous understanding. But what I mean by universal is there are no barriers for this truth. You cannot contain this truth. And I have touched that truth. Now, once I have touched and embodied the truth, how do you want me to live within the barriers? So therefore, I do not respect the barriers that is being thrusted upon me. Number two, when I said that the because of this sense of inner freedom, they have made very clear statement of not conforming to the conventions and the norms of the society, there has to be a clear differentiations from the dharma and the conventions and the norms of the society. Practically, there is no differentiation. We feel that all the conventions and the norms of the society are based on or informed by the dharma, but I think the sadhana and the sadhaks do arrive at a stage where they will be able to see certainly that the necessity and the need for these conventions and norms becomes more and more. So even Sri Aurobindo has written about it, Sri Anirvan has written about it. They say that at some point or the other, you will see that the form that we give and whatever the forms that it takes, they start losing the essence if the ritual is not kept up. And by the way, they are not ever away and non-compliant about the ritual aspects also. They have their own rituals. They understand the power of the rituals. Be it any of the subcategories and sub-traditions, they have their own rituals. There is like going for Madhukari and singing Harinam is a ritual. And waking up and we wake up Krishna in the morning, saying that Krishna, come wake up, and then we have to go for Madhukari and start the day. That is a ritual, right? And you are invoking the same divine forces which are integral part of the dharma. So that is not again a deviation or non-conformity. What I would say is that there is a huge amount of convergence and overlap with the society. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit unfathomable that I am defying everything that society says, but I'm going back to the same society for doing Madhukari, and they are the ones who are giving me and transacting with me. See, that sort of inconsistency is not there in this approach. It's just that they are not the householders like the other society. That's it. So they are the ones who are doing their practice. Like, for instance, it's very, very rare to find the spiritual traditions in India where there is a companion. With companion, you are doing the sadhana and spiritual, both man and woman who are living together. They're called Kepa Kepi, right? They are doing the sadhana together. This is totally unconventional. This cannot be equated with a typical householder's life. So they have taken the sannyasa, they have taken the vairagya diksha together, and they have had a special union which is acknowledged within the tradition, and they live together, and then they do their practice. So I don't know if I have addressed all the facets what you have raised. So this again very clearly said, this has got nothing to do with the current narratives of, be it secularism, be it any other aspect. If people want to make their inferences, anybody can make inferences from anything.
How much influence does balls have on Muslim community? Because whenever we equate and all that thing, we want to universalize. So does that universalism is accepted by Muslim community? Do they go to balls? Do they sing? Do get involved in all these things?
No, there
Or
are. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yes, please go ahead.
No, see, honestly, you see a lot of interchange of people following across the religions also. I have seen many Baul masters, and where there are people from other religions, be it even Islamic religion, they do come, they do follow certain masters. Maybe not in big number. There is a certain amount, because this has got a lot to do with the cultural undertoning. This has emerged in Bengal, and so there is a certain affiliation with the lot of other aspects of this tradition. But even within the Islamic community, they have their practice. The Shai Fakiri practice is pretty much within the Islamic community that happens. Do they face challenges? Yes, they do face challenges. They do face challenges from people who have reservations about this approach towards the divine, and this challenge is very prevalent, very well articulated. In fact, I have not done much delving deeper into it, but here, for instance, we receive many fakir masters here, because they find a great deal of, say, as I said, it is the sadhu sangha, right? Even Rabindranath Tagore, Gurudev, when he established these melas, Paush melas and all of that, and even Joydev Mela and all of that, so they have pretty much established space for every sub-traditions to come and share. Are there challenges? Are there tensions? There are challenges, there are tensions. There is no doubt about it. Even when people from sub-traditions come together, like any other, it's a competitive space. There is always a tension. Who is being given more greater space? Who is getting more respect? These things are always there. These tensions cannot be wiped out. I think humanistically, if we think that is possible to wipe, and it's our wrong assessment, these tensions are always there. But as an overall, tradition itself is facing a huge existential crisis and challenge. So, for instance, fakirs can have a Baul guru. Bauls can have a fakir guru. Fakirs wear Tulsi Mala. They also take the name of the Nitai. Right? So all these things are very much possible, and that interchange is there. There is a lot of mutual admiration. There is also a lot of tension, like any other human interactions. And we can always see it in the contexts that are currently real, and we can always understand from in that perspective also.
What kind of training or teaching or learning is involved when you would like to cultivate the habits or mind for this tradition? So what's the training look like? What are the components?
Well, I mean, as I said, it's a yogic tradition, so there is a strong element of yoga. See, first of all, there has to be initiation from the guru, and initiation is also multi-level initiation, and each one at a certain level, and then they are given something specifically. So there are, for instance, there are many who come who have this deep longing, but they are also exploratory in nature. And so it totally depends on the guru. Totally depends on the guru's reading. And what I have more than often have seen is that gurus are more than willing to teach, but obviously a lot of modern day constraints come into picture, and the reservation about the teaching the tradition always is there. So coming to the specifics of it, there is a very strong element of the yoga. There are certain specific rituals. Once you are initiated, there are certain specific rituals you are expected to follow. There are mantras which are very potent in generating the power of devotion specifically. So you are coming from the Tantra Mantra Marga, you see, and even that aspect is there. And a lot of aspects of the Tantra are kind of the important templates are taken. So when I ask, even Parvati ji, she tells that bowls have taken essence from many, many, many places, and they have, developed this. In a way, honestly, this is the reality. This is the case, especially with the later medieval cases. You will see this, that obviously so much infusion of the great number of traditions has happened independently before, that at some point they had to confluence, and people would develop. You take, for instance, Yoga Vashishta. It will reflect on Advaita. It will reflect on Vedanta. It will reflect on the Samvit. It will reflect on the Bhashya from the perspective of the Kashmir Shaivism. So that sort of confluences these are realistic. It is the same case with the Tripura Rahasya. It is the same case with many other philosophical. So it's the same thing that has happened here. But Bowls have consciously taken those elements and integrated it. So that strong element of the Tantra is there. That strong element of the mantra patana. But again, there will be variation between the sub traditions. Not all of them are using this in the same consistent templated way. And most importantly, to cultivate bhakti in a body which is capable of holding the power of the bhakti. So you do the yoga and the yoga sadhana. There are certain yogic, postures and things that are taught. And then, most importantly, you see the ektara that they hold. That is ektara. This is Ida and Pingala, and the central string is the Sushumna. That is the yogic significance of ektara, and it is held in the body, right? So that is what they are playing. So one learns to play ektara or sing, if that is what is one's inclination. There are also, as I said, the scholar practitioners who are not necessarily singing, but they are steady. An important aspect that I have to tell in the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya is that there are certain scholars called Akinchan Das. All of them post Krishnaraj Kaviraj, who has written Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Katha, Bhagavatam. And so his successors have written many books which are very specific to Vaishnava Sahajiya. Amrita Rasaratnavali, Amrita Ratnavali. And they have very clearly incorporated many practices related in there. Though this is, I cannot say it's a Nirgrantik tradition, it's more of a Guru Sishya Parampara. So Grantha influence is very limited, but there are within the Vaishnava Sahajiya, these Granthas are there. So some people develop the knowledge of that. Some people contemplate, the scholars, the Goshais contemplate on the Chaitanya Bhagavatam. So all these aspects are there. And so these are all of them, the songs. One gets to learn the Mahajanirpad and contemplate. All these songs have specific tattvas, Guru Tattva. You are singing and meditating upon Guru. Who is Guru? How the Guru is influenced. Sadhana Tattva. How are you preparing your body? What are the chakras in the body? How does the energy, the Shakti Sanchalanam happen in the body? Then you have the Gaur Tattva. You are exclusively contemplating on the Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as the Mahabhava, how Radha and Krishna are the two united realities in him. You see, like this, many tattvas are there, and not all tattvas are given to the beginner. You have to proceed, and progress well in order to achieve more tattvas and understand more tattvas. Yeah, so this is broadly the sadhana.
Amazing to hear that. It's a wonderful training, and primarily it's a sadhana path. It's yogic discipline, as you have been mentioning it in your talk all along. And because when you first go on internet and just see, you will find balls as a bard, balls as a minstrels, and something which is again prone to misinterpretation and all those things.
Yeah.
Because that aspect is only about singing and recitation. But this singing is something which is rooted in sadhana. It is not mechanical, or like you're doing a show, you just recite and go out and perform. I just like to thank you that you have brought out all these aspects